everyone, welcome back to your revision. This week we are exploring the context behind the play Macbeth in order to help you make relevant links in your essays ready for your exam. So what we need to do today is we need to look at why is context important when we're studying Macbeth. And we need to think about what actually is context. So context is the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood. So the big question we need to be thinking about is, why did Shakespeare write this play? And this helps us understand how to analyse the language, the characters and the themes of the play, because Shakespeare's chosen each of these very specifically. And because Shakespeare is not alive to tell us these reasons, we have to look at what society was like during his life and how this might have shaped his own beliefs and intentions. And the most important thing you need to understand is that Shakespeare wrote his plays for a specific purpose, and that was to teach his audiences key messages. Now, to understand Shakespeare's intentions for writing the play Macbeth, we need to look at what Jacobean society was like and what was happening there. So there were three main ideas or events that were really popular during the Jacobean era that will have impacted and shaped Shakespeare's play and the characters he produced. The first one is the reign of King James I of Great Britain. The second will be the religious beliefs that were taking place during the Jacobean era. And the last one is the fear of the supernatural. We'll actually dive into that in next week's video, so don't worry about that one for this week. Firstly then, obviously, as I said before, we need to be thinking about what life was like in society when Shakespeare was alive. Now, Shakespeare was actually alive during two different monarchs. The first monarch was Queen Elizabeth, who was the daughter of King Henry VIII, and the second monarch, when Queen Elizabeth died, was King James I, who then succeeded the English throne. He was already King of Scotland at the time. And during this time, under the rule of Queen Elizabeth, the country, England, was predominantly Protestant, and this was a religion that was created by King Henry VIII, as I'm sure you're aware. Now, Catholics were not able to worship freely, and they had many restrictions that were put in place. Okay, towards the end of Queen Elizabeth's reign, Catholics were given fines if they were caught practicing their religion. And when King James I succeeded the throne, the English Catholics were really hopeful that he would remove these religious restrictions, purely based on the fact that his wife was Catholic and his mother was Catholic. But this didn't happen. And in February 1604, King James I announced his utter detestation of Catholics and fined hundreds of recusants. Okay? And what we could see here is the sorts of laws that Queen Elizabeth was putting in place was being upheld by King James I. And obviously, this caused a lot of hostility. This refusal to allow Catholics to worship freely, despite King James I's own connections to the Catholic religion, led to the Gunpowder Plot, which was led by John Catesby. And the Gunpowder Plot was a failed attempt to assassinate King James I. And in Jacobean society, assassinating a monarch defied all religious beliefs. So this was deemed as something that was horrific that occurred within this time. And because there was an attempt on King James I's life, we need to think about, why was this so abhorrent during the Jacobean era? And as always, religion can become a contentious issue, a political issue, which means that Shakespeare, at the time of writing, could not openly, directly talk about religion and his own thoughts and opinions. But we know that Shakespeare makes references to religion within his play Macbeth, and he references heaven, hell, and also the disruption of the natural order. And this reference to the natural order is linking to the belief of the great chain of being, which is a hierarchical structure of all life within the world. Okay, and it was launched in medieval Christianity, and they believed that this natural order was decreed by God. And because of this belief, the great chain of being, it was believed that God had created that social order for everybody, and God chose where you belonged. In other words, the king or queen was in charge because God had put them there on that throne, and they were obviously only answerable to God, which is called the divine right of kings. This meant that disobeying the monarch was a sin, which obviously is very handy for a monarch to keep people in their place, because this sort of ultimate power that they had would have been feared, or should have been feared. And although this belief, as we've mentioned, started in the medieval era, this continued through to the Jacobean era. And it's really interesting to look at what King James I thought about this belief of the great chain of being. And he actually heavily relied on this belief. Okay, he even addressed Parliament, stating that he believed that monarchs are God's lieutenants. Okay, and because Shakespeare was a royalist, he was a supporter of the monarch at the time, because through this support of the monarch, of Queen Elizabeth and then King James I, this meant that he got lots of privileges if they felt that his writing was impressive. And he uses the play Macbeth to directly show his support of King James I's reign and support King James I's supremacy, his ultimate power as king. And in the play, through Macbeth's act of regicide, the audience, Shakespeare's wanting his audience to view regicide as being something that is horrific and nihilistic. I love this word nihilistic because I think it's really useful to use within your essays, because it's a really concise way of looking at how the act of regicide is rejecting religious and moral beliefs. So, through our now really solid understanding of how societal events impacted Shakespeare's writing and shaping his characters and his ideas, we can summarise what we think some of Shakespeare's intentions are. And as I told you before, Shakespeare uses the play to encourage his audience to conform to certain societal expectations. So I've listed 3 here for you. Firstly, he uses the play to encourage the audience to admire and support King James I's reign. He uses the play to condemn assassination attempts against the monarch, and he uses the play and Macbeth's arc to reveal the consequences of what happens when this is committed. And then he uses the play to reinforce the supremacy of the monarchy. So these are all intentions that you could use within your essays, and it's your way of showing a really solid understanding of the contextual ideas that affected Shakespeare's writing. Now we know the contextual factors that influenced Shakespeare's writing, you can use this understanding to enhance your own analysis and to enhance the references to the authorial intentions. And the first thing we're going to look at is the first authorial intention, which is that Shakespeare uses the play to encourage the audience to admire and support King James I. And he does this in a multitude of ways, but I've picked specifically 2. The first way is through the character of Banquo. Now, it is believed that King James I was a descendant of Banquo, and that's really important, and I'll explain its importance in a little second. Banquo, as a character in the play, is morally superior in comparison to Macbeth. And Macbeth himself frequently acknowledges Banquo's sort of positive attributes, his wisdom, and how valiant he is. And he suggests in his soliloquy that Banquo hath the wisdom that doth guide his valour to act in safety. And what's happening here is Shakespeare's using Macbeth's soliloquy to highlight Banquo's valiant and noble nature. But not only this, Shakespeare's using Banquo's character to reinforce the great chain of being. The witches have predicted that Banquo's lineage will attain the throne. And through Banquo's valour and his wisdom, he is therefore rewarded eternally because he is the descendant, or believed to be the descendant, of King James I himself. Again, reinforcing this idea that the audience are supposed to support King James I, the rightful king, and his decisions are always going to be supreme. The second way we see Shakespeare using sort of royalist propaganda is through the character King Duncan. And in the play, King Duncan is the rightful monarch, and his reign is declared to be passed to his son Malcolm, who he announces to be the Prince of Cumberland. Now, this is really interesting because in the 11th century, sort of kings did not usually pass their the throne to their eldest son. That is something that was more a modern idea, and something that obviously took place in the Jacobean era. So King Duncan's reign of Scotland is in accordance with the great chain of being. He is the rightful monarch, and he is the mouthpiece to God. However, through Macbeth's act of regicide, this is disrupted, and it was always believed that if the great chain of being was disrupted, chaos would therefore ensue. Macbeth describes King Duncan, and he says, "Here lay Duncan," this is after he's committed that act, "here lay Duncan, his silver skin laced with his golden blood." Shakespeare's description of King Duncan highlights the belief that a monarch is faultless and noble. The references to the precious materials of silver and golden reinforces the belief that a monarch is viewed as ultimately supreme, which therefore makes the act of regicide so shocking to the audience. And we've got this use of this character that is proving that and reminding the audience how horrific the gunpowder plot was. Okay, let's explore the second authorial intention. So, as I said before, Shakespeare uses the play to condemn the assassination attempts against the monarch and reveal the consequences that would occur if this is acted out. How do we use this authorial intention to analyse the language within the play? So the first one is actually my favourite quotation within the play. I absolutely love it. And it's Shakespeare's using Macbeth's thoughts of regicide to condemn this act. And this is before Macbeth has had communications with Lady Macbeth, before Lady Macbeth has used her powers of persuasion to sort of encourage him to follow through with the plan. Macbeth has always had these thoughts. He was not innocent. It wasn't Lady Macbeth who was imagined up sort of the plan. He was already thinking about this, and his thoughts were immediately formed as soon as King Duncan announced that Malcolm was to be Prince of Cumberland, so the next in line to the throne. And Macbeth's thoughts immediately turn really dark and really sinister. And he says about the thoughts of regicide, he describes it as having a horrid image, doth unfix my hair and make my seated heart knock at my ribs. And Shakespeare describes the regicidal thoughts as being completely unnatural. This response to these thoughts make Macbeth feel really uncomfortable. His hair is standing on end and his heart is beating really fast. And here we can see that Shakespeare's using this moment to prove to the audience that regicide defies expectations within Jacobean society. The fact that these are only thoughts, okay, the act hasn't even been planned out, it hasn't been committed, it's just the sort of action of the thoughts, and it causes Macbeth such distress. This intensifies how the act of regicide is completely immoral, okay? And then secondly, so we've got pre-action, the thoughts and the processes thoughts are going through as he's deciding and sort of figuring out how it is he's going to attain the throne himself, and his first thoughts on murder. We've then got what is described after the act of regicide. Now, this next quotation takes place when Ross and the old man discuss the murder of King Duncan. And they describe that a falcon towering in her pride of place was by a mousing owl hawked at and killed. And what we see here, this description lays the foundation of the chaos that will ensue in the play later on, okay, due to the abhorrent act of regicide. And we can see that they're discussing this idea that a mousing owl, which would be lower in the pecking order to a falcon, okay, which would be considered the supreme bird of prey, has been killed, okay? And it's the reference to Macbeth dishonestly taking the crown for himself, but also it's a reference to how the great chain of being has been disrupted. And Macbeth has removed the supreme monarch and taken his place. And the verbs hawked and killed intensify the sinister actions of Macbeth, okay? So that verb hawk, this idea that it's been plotted, it's been planned, there's been scheming involved, and then the action has taken place as well. Okay, that is it for today's video. I hope you've all enjoyed looking at the context at a deeper level, and join me next week for your video on the witches. See you next week.